Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where you give us a stack of material articles, research your notes, and we jump in to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight for you.
Exactly. Think of it as your personal shortcut to being really well informed, without getting completely buried in all the details.
So today, we're diving into some recent statements and reports. They touch on the conflict in Ukraine, some discussions around peace talks, and other international exchanges involving Russian President Putin and U.S. President Trump. And this is all based purely on the sources you've shared with us.
That's right.
Our mission, really, for this deep dive is just to unpack the core information, the perspectives presented in this material, and give you a clear overview of what's actually in there.
Absolutely. And, the material we're exploring definitely covers some complex and sensitive topics. So we'll be presenting the information just as it appears in the reports and statements you've provided.
Mm-hmm.
The focus is on clarity, neutrality, and highlighting the different points and perspectives laid out.
Okay, perfect. Let's jump right in then and unpack this material. We're going to start by looking at some reports focusing on Russian President Putin's perspective, drawing directly from one of the main reports you included.
Right. So one report details a pretty significant meeting Russian President Putin held. It's described as an expanded meeting with his cabinet. This gives us a kind of window into the discussions and views shared within that specific context, at least as presented in the material.
Okay, an expanded cabinet meeting. And what was the reported context? Like, what led up to this specific meeting, according to the material?
Well, the report gives some background. It mentions this meeting apparently followed presentations from a couple of key individuals.
Okay.
One was Vladimir Medinsky, who's identified as the head of a negotiating group. He reportedly gave an update on the results of meetings that had previously taken place in Istanbul.
Right, it's just
And alongside that, the meeting also reportedly got updates from various ministers and security officials. These were about alleged terror attacks. Specifically, the material mentions incidents in the Kursk and Bryansk regions.
Ah, okay.
So the agenda, as it's reported, seems to combine updates on sort of diplomatic efforts with these immediate security concerns.
And it was during this meeting, this expanded cabinet meeting, as the material describes it, that Russian President Putin apparently voiced a pretty significant opinion about the current Ukrainian authorities. What did he reportedly say?
He's presented in the material as stating his opinion that, in his view, the current Ukrainian authorities, quote, peace is not needed. That's a very strong assertion attributed to him in the report.
Peace is not needed. Wow. And did the material provide the reasoning he gave for that view? What was the basis for that opinion as he reportedly, laid it out?
Yes. The report does elaborate on his reasoning. It states that Russian President Putin said the reason for this opinion is that these authorities are, quote, concerned only with maintaining power.
Maintaining power.
Right. That's presented as his assessment of their primary motivation, which, in his view, influences their approach to the conflict and any potential peace talks. It's the core explanation he reportedly offered for why he believes peace isn't their objective.
The material also flags a specific detail reported by Vladimir Medinsky during the same meeting, something concerning humanitarian efforts.
Okay, that's correct. The report mentions that Medinsky apparently informed the cabinet that the Ukrainian side had initially agreed to, but then subsequently refused, a proposed 2 or 3 day truce. This truce was intended specifically for humanitarian reasons.
A humanitarian truce refused.
Yeah. That specific incident was reportedly raised within the meeting as part of Medinsky's update on the negotiation outcomes.
And how did Russian President Putin reportedly react or comment on this specific instance, the refused truce, based on what's in the material?
Well, the material indicates that Russian President Putin did comment on it. He noted that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. His reported reaction to the refusal was quite concise. He's quoted as saying about it, quote, "This does not surprise us."
Does not surprise us.
Right. Which suggests, as it's presented in the report, a view that this type of action was, in his mind, consistent with his broader assessment of the situation.
The report also includes Russian President Putin's views on individuals he refers to as the Ukrainian glavaries. Now, that's not a common English term, but the material gives context. How are these individuals characterized, according to the material?
Yeah, the material quotes him using some very pointed language to describe these figures. He reportedly called them, quote, rotten through and completely corrupt.
Wow.
And to emphasize the point, he apparently added, the whole world talks about this.
Yeah.
The material indicates that this term glaveries is used in a context when discussing the Kiev Yuzmyev, which basically translates to the key elite or, the leadership figures.
The key elite.
Exactly. The description provided in the material is clearly intended to be highly critical of these individuals.
And he reportedly connected certain alleged actions to these key VOA or key elite figures that are mentioned in the material. What were those actions, and what was the link he reportedly made?
The material states that Russian President Putin linked their reported actions, specifically mentioning a move towards organizing, quote, terror attacks.
Terror attacks.
Yes. And in this context, the report explicitly references attacks on railways in the Bryansk and Kursk regions, which you remember were also mentioned as a topic presented to the cabinet earlier.
Right, the same regions.
He reportedly linked these alleged actions to what he described as huge losses on the front. So as presented in the material, his view is that these alleged shifts towards certain types of attacks were a direct consequence of military difficulties faced by Ukrainian forces.
Okay, so linking those alleged attacks to battlefield losses. Now, the material highlights what Russian President Putin reportedly saw as an apparent contradiction in the actions and requests coming from the Ukrainian side around this time. What was this contradiction, as reported?
Right. The report points out that Russian President Putin highlighted this contrast between these alleged actions and the reported military losses on one hand.
Okay.
And the requests being made concurrently by the Ukrainian side on the other. He reportedly stated that at the same time all this was happening, the Ukrainian side was asking to suspend combat operations for significant periods like 30 or even 60 days.
30 or 60 days?
Yes, and simultaneously requesting a high-level meeting between leaders. The material frames this juxtaposition as a contradiction he reportedly noted.
Okay. And how did Russian President Putin reportedly articulate his response or his perspective on this reported contradiction? What did the material say about that?
The material conveys his response through a series of rhetorical questions he apparently posed during the meeting. He reportedly asked, quote, "But how can such meetings be held under these conditions?"
Right.
Following that, he questioned, "What is there to talk about? Who generally conducts negotiations with those who rely on terror with terrorists?" And he continued asking, why encourage them by providing a respite in combat operations, which will be used to pump the regime with Western weapons? These questions, as they're reported, strongly convey his skepticism about the feasibility or even the purpose of negotiations or truces under the circumstances he described.
That's very clear. The material also includes a strong statement attributed to Russian President Putin regarding alleged attacks targeting civilians. What did he reportedly say about that?
He's quoted directly in the report on this point. He reportedly stated that the, quote, strike was deliberately aimed at the civilian population.
Deliberately aimed?
Yes. And the material presents this statement and immediately follows it with his broader conclusion, adding that, quote, "This only confirms our fears that the already illegitimate regime in Kyiv, which once seized power, is gradually degenerating into a terrorist organization."
That's a very strong characterization.
Extremely strong, yes.
Yeah.
Linking alleged specific actions directly to his assessment of the Ukrainian government as presented in the material.
Okay. Moving on slightly, the material mentions that Russian President Putin also commented on reported Ukrainian criticism regarding the composition of the Russian delegation, the one appointed for negotiations.
Yes, he reportedly addressed this criticism. As presented in the material, his response was, quote, "We're dealing with people who do not possess any significant competence or basic political culture if they allow themselves certain kinds of statements regarding those with whom they are trying to agree on something."
Okay.
So this comment, as reported, suggests he viewed that particular criticism from the Ukrainian side as, well, unprofessional or lacking basic diplomatic standards, in his opinion.
It's interesting, though, that the material you provided offers a contrasting perspective from the Ukrainian side, apparently articulated around the same general time frame as this cabinet meeting we've been discussing. What was reported from that angle?
Right, that's a key point in the material. It notes that approximately an hour before this meeting in the Kremlin, Ukrainian President Zelensky made a statement.
An hour before.
Roughly, yes. Yeah. He reportedly characterized a Russian memorandum, one containing ceasefire conditions, as an ultimatum.
An ultimatum.
That's the word used in the report. Furthermore, he stated that while a meeting between the leaders of Russia and Ukraine was necessary, it could only happen after Russia ceases fire.
Only after a ceasefire from Russia?
Correct. So the material presents these two very different positions: Russian President Putin's views expressed in the cabinet meeting, and Ukrainian President Zelensky's conditions for a meeting, and his characterization of the memorandum as being expressed almost concurrently.
Okay, so you mentioned this Russian memorandum with conditions. The material you shared provides details about its content. Can you break down what this memorandum reportedly proposed?
Sure. The material provides a description of this memorandum, outlining that it consisted of two main parts.
Two parts, okay.
The first part was reportedly focused on how to achieve what it termed real long-term peace.
Real long-term peace. Got it.
This section, as described, proposed several key points. These included the withdrawal of the armed forces of Ukraine, referred to as the AFU, from the DNR, LNR, Zaporozhye, and Kherson regions.
Withdrawal from those four regions.
Yes, and their subsequent placement at an agreed distance from Russia's borders. It also proposed that Ukraine adopt a neutral and non-nuclear status.
Neutral and non-nuclear.
Agree to a maximum size for its army, participate in the lifting of mutual sanctions, and engage in a phased restoration of diplomatic and economic relations. Those are the key conditions reportedly laid out in that first part for achieving long-term peace.
Okay, that covers the first part, the one focused on long-term peace. What about the second part of the memorandum? What steps that it reportedly proposed were necessary for a full ceasefire?
So the second part is apparently titled Package Proposal in the material, and it specifically lists the conditions reportedly deemed necessary for a full ceasefire.
A package proposal for a ceasefire.
Exactly. These conditions included a, quote, prohibition on redeployment of the AFU, meaning forces shouldn't be moved to new positions.
Okay, no redeployment.
It also called for conducting demobilization of forces. Another key condition listed was stopping the deliveries of foreign weapons to Ukraine.
Stopping weapon deliveries.
And, quote, excluding military presence of third countries there. The memorandum also included provisions for the mutual release of political prisoners and detained civilians, the lifting of martial law in Ukraine.
Lifting martial law, too.
And finally, the announcement of dates for both presidential and parliamentary elections in Ukraine. So, as presented in the material, this memorandum laid out pretty extensive conditions across these two phases, one for the long term, and a specific package of steps for achieving an immediate ceasefire.
That provides a really detailed look at the points presented in that first body of material, focusing on Russian President Putin's statements from that cabinet meeting and the specifics of that Russian memorandum.
Okay, shifting gears slightly now, the material you provided also covers international contact, specifically a recent phone call.
Yes, another part of the material discusses a recent discussion that took place between U.S. President Trump and Russian President Putin.
Okay, a Trump-Putin call. How is this call characterized in the report?
According to the report covering this call, it was apparently their fourth phone conversation since the beginning of the year.
Fourth call this year.
Yes. And the material also provides its reported duration, stating it lasted 1 hour and 15 minutes. 1 hour and 15 minutes. Okay. What were the main topics reportedly discussed during this call, based on U.S. President Trump's account as it's presented in the material?
The material indicates that U.S. President Trump himself listed the subjects. He mentioned the recent attack reportedly carried out by Ukraine on Russian airfields as a key topic.
The airfield attack, right?
And he also broadly referred to discussing other attacks, quote, carried out by both sides. Those seem to be the primary points of discussion he identified, according to the report.
And how did U.S. President Trump reportedly describe the overall nature or maybe the outcome of this conversation in the material?
The report quotes U.S. President Trump's description directly. He's reported to have written that it was a, quote, good conversation, but not one that will lead to immediate peace.
Good conversation, but not immediate peace.
Exactly. That characterization suggests that while the exchange itself was considered positive from his perspective, it didn't result in any immediate breakthrough or resolution regarding the ongoing conflict, at least in his view.
Focusing on that airfield attack that was reportedly discussed, what was Russian President Putin's reported response or stance on it during the call? Again, based on U.S. President Trump's account in the material.
Well, the material conveys U.S. President Trump's statement regarding Russian President Putin's reaction. He reported that Russian President Putin, quote, said and very strongly that he would have to respond to the recent attack on the airfields.
Said very strongly he'd have to respond.
Yes, that point is presented as a significant message conveyed by the Russian president during the conversation, as interpreted and reported by U.S. President Trump.
The material also provides more specific details about this particular airfield attack that was reportedly a topic of discussion. Can you share what was reported about that event itself?
Yes, the material offers some specifics about the attack referenced in the call. It reportedly occurred on June 1st.
June 1st.
According to the report, the Ukrainian military reportedly used FPV drones in this attack. These drones were apparently used to target airfields in several regions within Russia: Murmansk, Irkutsk, Ivanovo, Ryazan, and the Amur regions.
Multiple regions targeted.
Yes. And the material summarizes the reported outcomes. It states that attacks were repelled in the Ivanovo, Ryazan, and Amur regions.
Okay, repelled there.
But in the Murmansk and Irkutsk regions, the material reports that fires broke out on several units of aviation equipment. However, these fires were subsequently extinguished.
Fires extinguished. Any casualties reported?
Importantly, no. The report also states that there were no casualties reported among military personnel or civilians resulting from these attacks.
Okay, no casualties. Did the material include any other reactions or comments about this attack from other officials, maybe within the U.S. administration?
Yes, it does. The material notes that statements were made by U.S. officials concerning this incident. It mentions that White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre reportedly stated that Ukraine did not notify U.S. President Trump in advance of their plans for this attack.
No advance notice.
Right. And the material also includes a comment from the special envoy for the U.S. President, Keith Kellogg. He reportedly commented on the attack by stating that the actions of the Ukrainian military significantly increased the risk of escalation of the conflict.
Increased escalation risk. Okay.
So those points provide some additional context from the U.S. perspective on the reported attack as presented in the material.
Right. Now, beyond the conflict-related topics, the material indicates that another significant international issue was discussed during the call between U.S. President Trump and Russian President Putin. What was that?
Yes, the material mentions that U.S. President Trump also discussed the possibility of a new nuclear deal with Iran with Russian President Putin during this conversation.
The Iran nuclear deal.
Okay.
And what was Russian President Putin's reported stance or sort of willingness to engage on this matter, again, based on U.S. President Trump's account in the material?
The material relays U.S. President Trump's statement that the Russian president expressed readiness to participate in negotiations on this issue.
Readiness to participate.
Yes. That suggests a reported willingness on the Russian side to be involved in discussions regarding a potential new agreement concerning Iran's nuclear program, as reported by U.S. President Trump.
And what specific view did U.S. President Trump reportedly convey to Russian President Putin regarding Iran's nuclear ambitions during this call? What does the material say there?
The material explains that U.S. President Trump stated he conveyed the point that it is unacceptable for Iran to possess nuclear weapons.
Unacceptable.
Right. He then added his perception of Russian President Putin's reaction, saying he, quote, felt that the Russian president agreed with this position. So, as presented, this was a key point U.S. President Trump reportedly made, along with his impression of the Russian response.
Interesting that he used the word felt. U.S. President Trump also included a personal opinion in his remarks, as presented in the material, regarding Iran's current approach to decision-making on this whole issue.
He did. The material shares U.S. President Trump's reported opinion that he believes Iran is currently, quote, stalling for time on making a decision on this very important issue.
Stalling for time?
Yes. And he reportedly concluded this thought with a clear sense of urgency, stating, quote, and we will need a final answer very shortly. This reflects his reported assessment of the current state of play regarding Iran's nuclear decision.
Okay. The material you provided also includes some helpful background information on the history of the Iran nuclear deal, just for context. Can you summarize that for us?
Sure. The material provides context by mentioning the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, often called the JCPOA, or simply the Iranian nuclear deal.
Right, the JCPOA.
It describes this as an agreement signed back in 2015 by Iran and several world powers: the U.S., China, Russia, Great Britain, France, and Germany. The core purpose, as described in the material, was that Iran would limit its nuclear program significantly in exchange for the lifting of international sanctions. The specific goal was to ensure Iran couldn't create nuclear weapons.
Okay, the 2015 deal.
But then the material notes a significant change, that during his first term, U.S. President Trump withdrew the U.S. from the JCPOA and imposed new sanctions on Iran.
Right, the withdrawal.
Following that, about a year later, Tehran reportedly suspended its own obligations under the deal. So this background helps frame the current discussions about a potential new agreement.
Okay, that makes sense. Speaking of current negotiations regarding this issue, what is their reported status based on the information in the material? What's happening now?
Well, the material details the information available on the ongoing negotiations for a new nuclear deal between Iran and the U.S. It states these negotiations reportedly began in April 2025.
April 2025.
As of the reporting, 5 rounds of talks have taken place. The material notes these negotiations have mostly occurred in Oman and, importantly, have been indirect.
Indirect talks.
Yes, meaning messages and positions have been passed between the parties through intermediaries rather than direct face-to-face talks.
Okay. Through intermediaries.
Right. The material also identifies the reported lead negotiators for each side. Abbas Araki, identified as the head of the Iranian Foreign Ministry, has reportedly participated for Tehran. And Steve Witkoff, identified as special envoy for the president, has reportedly participated for Washington.
Okay, got the negotiators. And finally, just to close the loop on the phone call, was this call between U.S. President Trump and Russian President Putin officially confirmed by the Russian side, according to the material?
Yes, the material confirms this. It states that Russian Presidential Press Secretary Dmitry Peskov later confirmed the phone conversation took place between Russian President Putin and U.S. President Trump.
Peskov confirmed it.
Yes. And he also reportedly reiterated that this was indeed their 4th conversation since the beginning of the year, noting the previous one had taken place relatively recently on May 19th.
Okay. So based purely on the material you provided for this deep dive, we've pretty thoroughly explored the points raised regarding Russian President Putin's perspectives, presented in that cabinet meeting. That includes his views on the Ukrainian authorities, the reported context for certain alleged actions, and those detailed conditions laid out in the Russian memorandum.
Right.
And we've also dug into the specifics of the recent phone call between U.S. President Trump and Russian President Putin, covering their reported discussion on the Airfield attack and the potential for a new Iran nuclear deal. All of this just drawing strictly from the information presented in the material you shared with us.
That's right. We've really aimed to just lay out the key points and perspectives as they're described within the material itself, providing you with, hopefully, a comprehensive overview of the information contained in these reports and statements on these recent diplomatic exchanges and viewpoints.
So, as you, the listener, consider the information presented in the material, particularly the details of those proposed conditions in the Russian memorandum and the points reportedly discussed in that phone call between U.S. President Trump and Russian President Putin, maybe reflect on how these specific elements, just as they are reported, might interact with or influence the broader landscape of international relations and potential future developments.
It certainly highlights the interconnectedness of these issues and the very different perspectives being presented, all within the source material we looked at.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.